Hello, and welcome to a new series where we're going to dive into the world of game mechanics, how they work, why you might include them, and why you might avoid them in a game. How do they affect your overall gameplay experience? Do you have a health bar? Armor? How many hits can you take? How much damage do enemies do? Do you have any combat abilities? Can you shoot? Jump on enemies? Can you jump at all? These are the kind of things that determine the type of game that you're going to play, and either make the player feel empowered or vulnerable. So come along as we look into the mechanics of video games that have been used over the years, and how they have changed the way that games that they were used in, or how their absence has affected the way the player may approach the game. Today we're going to talk about a very humble mechanic: jumping. Do you ever wonder about jumping? I mean, it's been a part of games for almost as long as video games have been around, but when did it first show up? What did games look like before this mechanic was introduced? What would games that have this mechanic look like if they didn't have it? To understand this a bit better, let's go back to some games that came out before jumping was a thing in video games. Let's go way back for a minute and take a look at Pac-Man, one of the most popular games, well, ever pretty much. Now this came out in 1980. The game took the video game industry by storm. It gave the player a labyrinth-like maze to navigate and clear all the pellets, while avoiding ghosts chasing you and spawning multiple sequels in the series and even a popular cartoon show. Then there was Space Invaders, a simple shooter where the player would have to defend against an incoming army of, well, aliens. They would move ever and ever closer, interacting on your space, and you would have to fight them off. Even Centipede would see a player on a singular stage moving back and forth, defending a location. Then, in 1981, something happened. Something new. Character jumped. That game was Donkey Kong, and it was going to change the way we looked at games forever. Donkey Kong was a revolution to the gaming industry. While simplistic compared to today's standards, the ability to jump not only over gaps, but over obstacles, would change the way developers began approaching games. More entries would pop up in this series, eventually culminating in more and more games of this type coming out, one of which would move Pac-Man to one of the first side-scrolling platformers ever in the form of Pac-Land. Pac-Land would see the player moving over more than just one screen, and not just jumping over small gaps, but onto different sized platforms. Some of the platforms could rotate and move in different directions, paving the way for more games like Super Mario Bros. And Ghosts and Goblins. Games would grow in size as developers would build entirely new worlds, not only for horizontal scrolling, but vertical scrolling. These would immerse the player in levels and even worlds that they could navigate through, all because of a single jump. It wouldn't stop there, however. Games would take on new mechanics, extending the jump so that it included momentum, or allowing the character to jump again while he was in the air, pushing the mechanic further, allowing players more flexibility in the places that they could go. This would allow the designer to put things in new locations, hiding things in various spots for the player to discover, setting up new avenues for them to explore, leading to multiple exits out of the stage. The mechanic wouldn't be limited to the 2D platform, but would migrate, albeit somewhat painfully, to the 3D realm, allowing for players to have greater flexibility in how those levels would be designed as well. With all these advancements, some games would decide to find other ways to give the player mobility without using the particular jump mechanic. Burger Time was one such game. They looked at Donkey Kong and saw the ladders as a key mechanic. Giving you, a chef who was trying to assemble burgers, you would use these ladders for your verticality. You would have to avoid hostile food. I mean, look, I didn't make Burger Time, okay? And make a number of burgers required to finish the stage. Not allowing you to jump added to the tension of the game, because you would have to retreat to a ladder to avoid enemies and be aware of their patterns so that you could avoid getting caught and losing a life. Just think for a minute how different this game would be if you could just jump over enemies or defeat them by landing on top of them while doing the same task. It would radically change the way you approach the game, and even the level design would be radically different. Here's another example of a platformer that addressed this problem in a different way. This game is called VVVVV. I know, weird name, just stick with me. This is a retro-style platformer that allows the player to adjust gravity instead of jumping. players would adjust the gravity to have themselves fall either up or down to avoid hazards and to get over platforms, giving you a similar platforming design while still having the player without having the ability to jump at all. The exclusion of the jump mechanic in this game takes it from a standard platforming experience to a dynamic puzzle platformer. This forces the player not only to be quick at times, but to think more critically about each move before they do it. Examples of this type of gameplay can also be found in games like Gravity Rush. Gravity Rush, much like its namesake, allowed you to alter gravity. Now, this mechanic was used to allow you to basically fly, or as Buzz Lightyear would put it, falling with style, any given direction that you decided to adjust the gravity to. This mechanic would be further incorporated into the attack patterns of the character, as most of her powers allowed her to adjust gravity in a certain way to allow her to attack enemies in more dynamic areas. This took a basic 3D platformer and made it a unique and exponentially more interesting experience. This leads us up to one of the prime examples of a game that manages to do a very good job of platforming without actually giving the ability to jump in any way: Bionic Commando. This was one of the earliest games to give the player a grappling hook of sorts. You see, Super Joe, the main character, had his arm replaced with a bionic arm that could extend and retract, giving him the ability to snatch up power-ups from a distance, grapple up to ledges, and even use it to swing from one location to another. This both expanded the gameplay options as much as it limited them. Now let me explain that phrase for a second. Because you couldn't jump, you had to find the right spot to grapple onto in order to swing from one platform to another. This could lead to situations where you could swing under an enemy and climb up behind them to get the drop on them. You could also just use it to grapple straight up to avoid enemy fire and enemies entirely. It was also used with great effect to position your character in positions where they could shoot something that was hanging from the ceiling by grappling your way up. This was a way of allowing the developer to put things in more difficult and unique spots without giving the player 8-way directional aiming like in, say, Contra. Now, all of these examples have actually just been older games up until right now. Now let's go into a newer example, Super Magbot. In this game, you don't actually have a grappler or gravity or anything of that nature. You use magnetism. You use positive and negative polarity to launch and pull yourself to various different platforms, giving you a vastly different feel for movement and momentum as you push and pull yourself through various stages that this game has to offer, creating a truly unique experience. So as you can see, by not including an actual jump mechanic, you can make more unique and more diverse gaming experiences by finding alternative ways around it. You challenge the player and take what would be a standard platformer and making it something more radically unique and memorable by its actual exclusion. But since we've gone into so many examples of reasons and times you can't jump, I think it's time we take a look at one that's a little bit different. What do you say? So I know what you're saying. You're going, I've played those games. I know how to adjust to all that stuff. That's fine. What if I gave you another challenge? You can't stop jumping now. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Flea. This little gem is a homebrew game made in NES Maker. You're tasked with avoiding obstacles and collecting blood along the way, which you can then exchange for more lives. The challenge lies in the fact that you have no control over your jumping. Every other instance that I've mentioned to this point, you either had the ability to jump and you use it at your discretion, or you don't and you're given tools to work around that handicap. This makes for an excellent example of a developer forcing a player to react to having control of a basic action removed. This both simplifies the gameplay experience and makes it more complicated by forcing you to adapt to the rhythm the game puts the player into, making an excellent example of the use of jumping. With all this talking about the mechanic, we've still yet to talk about how it's actually executed. So let's take a step back for a minute and use Mario again as an example. Mario is capable of doing a short or long jump depending on the speed that you're going at that time. This is a prime example of taking a very basic mechanic, adding some depth to it, and making it far more flexible and adding complexity to it. Compare this to a game like Mega Man that doesn't really let momentum carry into his jump, and you have a very different game. Jumps have to be far more precise and your positioning just so, making it a much tougher and far less flexible experience. Batman is another prime example of this. In this, they made the jumping mechanic far more deliberate. It forces the player to think more before they actually execute a jump. This pushes the player to be more methodical and think a few steps ahead. that when you think back on it is rather brilliant because it makes you to think more like, well, Batman. It can also impart a lot about the character's personality, but I think we'll save that discussion for when we talk about set pieces and animation in later episodes. As you can see, since the addition of jumping in video games, it's radically changed the gaming landscape as we know it. Game developers have found unique and interesting ways not only to expand the scope and dynamics of level design to allow for more interesting games to play on, but they've also created unique ways to get around the issue of jumping in video games being so common, and present you with a more unique gameplay mechanic and restrictions by completely omitting the mechanic altogether, and all because of one little jump. What are some of your favorite gaming mechanics and how they enhance the gameplay of some of your favorite games? What new challenges did having those mechanics present to you? What opportunities did they give you? Can you think of some games that would be more interesting or dynamic if they'd used one of the other mechanics instead of a jump mechanic? Let me know in the comments below. I'd like to thank all of you that got to this point in the video. Hopefully this was an insightful look into a common and almost overlooked mechanic in video games. It's my hope that this series helps those of you that watch it to think more about the mechanics that are implemented in games, how they affect balance, challenges they present to the player, and what opportunities for new gameplay experiences can be had by tweaking them, overusing them, or removing them entirely. However, let me know what you think of this series and the ideas it presents in the comments. Do you love it? Hate it? Can you think of other ideas that the games use to immerse the player or force them to think in new ways that you'd like to see covered? However, I'd like to ask you for one last thing. Hit the like button if you enjoyed this video, and if you find more of my content you like, please subscribe. All this greatly helps my channel and lets me know that you like what I'm doing. But for now, have a great day, and until next time, happy gaming.